All right, it's no more news that Nigeria's inflation rate is at 18.12% in April, indicating the first decline in the headline inflation in about 20 months. Well, according to the Consumer Price Index report recently released yesterday by the NBS, this represents a 0.05 percentage points decline when compared to 18.17% recorded in March 2021. I have joining me via Skype is the head of retail investments at Chapel Hill, Denham, Mr. Ayodeji Ebo. Mr. Ayodeji Ebo, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me.
Yes, let me start this way. Were you expecting a decline in these figures? Yes, I know I wanted to focus more on trade and all of that. But of course, we saw inflation figures yesterday. And we must start with that. We can't have you join us and you not make a comment on that. What were you expecting?
Yeah. Our projection was 18.7%. So it came lower than our expectation. And it was would say it's a positive surprise, but it's also nothing much to rejoice about when you look at the amount. So it's just 5 basis points. So came down from 18.17 to 18.12. And when you dig deeply into that, you will discover that food inflation, which came in at 22.74, contributed. That declined from 22.95 last month. But when you look at the previous year, because we are looking at inflation on a year-on-year basis, you will discover that there was a monthly jump last year because that was when the lockdown started in April. So we discover when you look at it, there was for the food inflation, which moved from 0. The monthly for March 2020 was month-on-month for March 2020 was 0.94, which moved to 1.18 for April month-on-month inflation. So there's also that base effect, apart from maybe the supply, that based on what we were able to also discover that there was an increase in supply of food products in the month of April. And also contrary to expectation that the fasting period would also lead to increase in prices. So we also felt that maybe some of the consumers also bought ahead of the month, ahead of the fasting period, so which has to do with planning. But by and large, there's that I'll say high base effect factor that would also be responsible, but it's really nothing. So inflation rate at 22.94, that is still very high, and you look at the main inflation headline inflation rate at 18.12, still look very high, and there are still a lot of pressure points on inflation that may still lead to upward trend. So for us, it's really nothing to be exciting about. Yes, when you look at in terms of the trend, it's stopped the normal the normal trend of the consistent upward inflation for over, I think, 10 or 15 months.
Let me follow up with that. Yesterday I had a chat and an analyst was telling me that issues around border closure, forex issues, manufacturing challenges, and of course the impact of COVID-19, some moves made at that time, that the impact of that is what we face with regards to our inflation figures at this time. Do you agree to this fundamental, so to this point, this position?
Absolutely, I agree with that submission. And if you look at those major pressure points, are still very evident, and there's where you can still see that inflation rate is still very elevated, and that is why I said yes, the trend, it has bucked the upward trend, which is just about 5 basis points, 0.05%. But if you still look at the high cost of production, you look at the expectation in terms of PMS prices, you also look at expectation in terms of the minor review for the electricity tariff also coming in. So you can still see that it's really very evident. And looking at food inflation, this is the period where we should be expecting that a lot of planting should have been going on or should have been done. But if you look at the pace of insecurity in Nigeria, it's really very high. And the attack is even more on the farmers, which will mean that it will be less production. And if we are unable to plant significantly within the period where you're supposed to plant, then there's really nothing much that you're expecting to harvest. Yes, border has been reopened, but that still there's still that cost of transportation, which would also add to the cost of the goods. So by and large, I expect that the pressure points or the major downside risks are still very evident, and they are still here with us, and there's a lot that still needs to be done around that.
So some say this is the beginning of the downward trend for inflation figures. We expect it to continue to nosedive. Do you agree with that, or you still believe that we could hit the 19% threshold?
I think next month may tick higher than what we've seen this month, because when you also consider the base effect, and we may see a marginal increase. And also, in terms of the expectation, it's going to be scenario based. There are factors that will drive it. So if we see further adjustments in the FX, it has direct transmission effect on prices, because we import a lot. Secondly, you are also expecting the normal minor review based on the multi-tariff year order, the MITO. You expect multi-year tariff order rather. That we expect that there should be a minor review. Also for PMS, that's for petrol, we're also expecting that the subsidy would be removed, or if not even removed totally, maybe partially removed. So when you look at that, energy cost would go higher, and that would pressure inflation further. You see that increase in both from core inflation as well as food inflation, because there is also the element of importation that fits into the food inflation. So I think the expectation is going to be scenario based, and if some of these points that I've highlighted, the 3 points of FX adjustment, if it happens, the PMS subsidy, whether partially or fully removed, as well as the minor review that we're expecting in July, if those things happen, it's going to impact on the trend of inflation based on expectation.
A little bit about trade. Now, we've seen the WTO saying global trade costs declined globally about 15%. That's in about 19 years. That's happening in like 19 years. So that's really strange. What do you think is responsible for this? Everyone will say, I think the quick one is COVID-19. Or what more do you think?
Okay, very interesting. On the report, which measures the global cost, which is the global cost index. So the report covered about 43 countries and about 33 sectors between the year 2020 and 2018. And what the report was able to show was that for low-income economies, the global cost increased, but for high-income economies, global cost reduced. And also sectors that still had significant or topped in terms of global cost, manufacturing and services, are still very high based on the study. So what we can attribute to from the, let's say, the high-income economy, or what we call the developed economy, what may be responsible is technology. This is an 18-year study that try to capture the trend. So you would expect that in terms of, because the report is looking at your global cost or your foreign cost of trade compared to your domestic cost of trade. That's what the index is measuring. And you will discover that for most global economies, there will also be, in terms of technology, that would have come in terms of the cost of trade, cost of importation that would have set in. So that would have reduced the cost over time. So and also for when you look at it for less developed economy, they are also classified as low income economy. The cost, even domestically, in terms of bottlenecks, you see the supply chain disruptions that you see when you look at, for instance, for Nigeria, the infrastructure is still not there. Most things are moved via road rather than train, which increase the cost. So you would agree with me that the cost agree with what the submission of the reports, that cost for low income economies is still very high, but for high income economies it has gone down within the 18 years.
I'm also looking at tariff and trade policy issues. How well do you see all of this? We know what happened before now, between China and the United States. Do you see all of this also having effects on global trade, one way or the other?
Yes, I think it's really very important, and there's a major role that tariff will play. So you can see, for instance, coming home, looking at it for Nigeria and our neighboring countries, you would see that a lot of the neighboring countries are taking advantage of our high tariff system too, and they are bringing down their own tariff. So you see a lot of smuggling coming in. So most importers will prefer to import and bring down to some of the neighboring countries, not to mention names now, some of those neighboring countries, and bring them to Nigeria because of the lower tariff within that space. So there's a role that it plays, and you mentioned we saw the shock that happened during the trade war between China and US in terms of placing tariff on some of those goods, because what tariff does is that it increases the cost of your goods. So, and yes, Nigeria has always been trying to use tariff to reduce or to discourage importation. But what we typically see is that for a lot of the things that we're placing that high tariff on, most times we are unable to produce them. So the burden is always on Nigerians. So you discover the tariff on vehicle, for instance, which yes was reviewed downwards, but you could still see that it's still very high. The custom fee is still, I think, about 35%, and for new cars, what was waived was the one of the levies. I can't recall now, but that's when you are importing and you have to pay about 40 to 50% levy. It means that if you bring something in at 10 million and you are paying 5 million, it means Nigerians we're talking about inflation. Your purchasing power is reduced, so you may not be able to afford that item. And yes, we've seen it work in some sectors like the cement industry. We're self-sufficient, but I think that we should get to a level before we begin to get to a level in terms of production before we begin to use tariff to discourage importation of a lot of items. If not, Nigerians we would have to pay very high, pending when we're able to see local production catch up with the demand of those products.
So I see our dear DG of WTO having a lot to grapple with. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, what role do you see WTO playing in all of this? A lot of issues needs to be addressed when it comes to improving global trade.
Yes, I think yes, our work is well cut out for her. And especially in the period that we've had a lot of back and forth in terms of tariff, and it's caused a lot of distortion in the economy, in the global economy. So part of what would be on the front burner for her is to see how there can be harmonization, so that one economy does not take advantage of that at the disadvantage of another economy. So there will be harmonization, also ensuring that it's not you are fixing your tariff not at a disadvantage to another country. So I think what she would be looking at is to look at an holistic view of how it can, on a broad level, foster global trade and not be at a disadvantage to some economies, so that we can all, though economies that are still struggling or are still trying to come up, can also grow to match, so that their products are also very competitive, which is also very key.
It's always a pleasure having you join us on the show, Head of Retail Investment, Chapel Hill, Denham, Mr. Ayodeji Ebo. Thank you very much. I appreciate this.